Hello, HHT community, and welcome to our latest webinar. Today, you will have the opportunity to learn all about the groundbreaking Pazopanib clinical trial, for which eligibility criteria has been recently expanded. So, if you weren't previously eligible, you may now be. But more on that in just a minute from our panel of experts. As for me, my name is Riley Blevins. I'm the Senior Director of Global Community Engagement here at Cure HHT, and I will be moderating tonight's session. But before we jump in and get going, I first want to make you aware of some important news and announcements here at the Foundation. First, the calendar is turning to June in just a few days, which means National HHT Awareness Month and Global HHT Awareness Day are just around the corner. This year, our campaign theme is HHT Changemakers. Please stay tuned to our social media channels throughout the month as we'll be highlighting various changemakers within our community and their change-making work and impact. But you do not have to be a doctor or a researcher to be a changemaker. During the month, we are inviting you, our mighty community, to join our community of changemakers with a donation. Every gift, no matter the size, helps us create change. Look, the reality is the change we've created to date and the transformational change that we hope to create in the future, like curing this disease for once and for all, is not possible without your support. Our campaign homepage is live now, so you can visit curehht.org/HHT-changemakers to learn more about our campaign and make a donation today. We are also excited to announce the launch of a few new programs here at Cure HHT, both aimed to help change the trajectory of this disease. The first is the HHT Connect, the first ever global HHT patient registry. Our goal, it's simple, is to collect health information from as many HHT patients as possible so that researchers and doctors can discover patterns and clues that can help them better understand HHT and develop new treatments. By answering a handful of simple questions, you can help advance HHT research and do so all from the comfort of your own home. I would strongly encourage everyone to visit our webpage, learn more, and sign up. Our next program has been highly requested. Cure HHT is excited to announce the launch of the HHT Continuing Education Hub. Now, providers seeking to further their HHT knowledge can receive continuing education credits at any time when they complete a course online. While these classes are geared more towards medical professionals, patients, you all can play a role in advancing HHT awareness by sharing information about this program with your local non-HHT doctors today. Visit our website to learn more. Also, we're excited to share our 15th HHT International Scientific Conference will be held at the Pullman Mandalou Bay in Mandalou-la-Napoule, France on October 15th through the 19th, 2024. This conference is one of the most meaningful ways we advance treatment and care within HHT. It fuels innovation and sparks collaboration amongst the world's leading physicians, researchers, and scientists. Registration is now open, and I will divulge, we are set to break some records at this conference in terms of the number of abstracts and poster presentations and oral presentations. Cure HHT, we continue to grow the medical community who focuses on this disease, and ultimately that impacts you, the patients. Next, as you will hear more about today, participating in research is perhaps one of the most meaningful ways you can contribute to a brighter future for our disease and its patients. We have several research projects underway, and you can learn more about things like the Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium and tissue donation by visiting the research section of our website. Finally, before we get our session underway, I wanted to go over some housekeeping rules for this webinar to make it as impactful and interactive as possible. First, if you have a question tonight for the presenters, please type it into the Q&A box to the right of your screen. We recommend that you keep your questions general in nature so they benefit everyone. I will ask as many questions as time allows. We will post resources relevant to tonight's topic in the chat box. You can use the chat box to make comments to either an individual or to all participants on the webinar, but please do not post questions for the presenters in the chat box. Again, all questions should be typed into the Q&A box. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be saved in the Cure HHT website's resource library. And at the end of the discussion, you will be emailed a survey. Your input is critical for the development of future webinars, so please do take a few minutes to give us your feedback and fill that out. If you are interested in the Pazopanib trial, you can also let us know that in this survey. And with that, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Cassi Friday is the Director of Research Programs and Grants here at Cure HHT. She joined our team after completing her PhD from the University of Kentucky. Cassi is also a caregiver for her husband and 2 of their 3 children who have HHT. With us tonight, we also have Dr. James Gossage, who is the Director of the HHT Center of Excellence at Augusta University. Dr. Gossage is also the Principal Investigator for the Pazopanib clinical trial. At the end of their presentations, we will hold a moderated 30-minute Q&A session. And with that, let's get going. Dr. Friday, I will turn things over to you. If you could please turn on your camera and share your slides.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, can you see my slides up? Yeah. All right, thank you for the introduction. We have a lot of stuff going on at Cure HHT, and I'm very excited about all of it, particularly this clinical trial. We've had a webinar about it before, but as Riley mentioned, some things have changed concerning our eligibility criteria. And I'm just going to take a second to orient us around why we are running this clinical trial in the first place. As a patient advocacy organization, it's not typical for us to run a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial, especially for FDA registration. But we have found ourselves in this position, and I wanted to give a little bit of backstory and history why. And it kind of starts with one of our most notorious change makers, Dr. Dennis Sprecher, who was working at GSK, a pharmaceutical company, who had a product called Votrient at the time. And he was thinking that this product, which is an anti-angiogenic, or a product that's used in cancer to sort of stop the vessel growth in tumors, would perhaps be a good fit for reducing the number of vessel malformations or reducing the amount of bleeding in HHT. And so it was Dr. Sprecher, who's currently the medical monitor and lead of this study from the medical standpoint of the foundation, who initiated the talks of taking Votrient, owned by GSK at the time, and putting it into the early stages of a clinical trial for HHT. And again, this indication was used for kidney cancer, and that's typically what the drug was used for, what we call like the indication of the drug, but we were using it off-label in this clinical trial for the treatment of HHT at a dose that's much lower than what's indicated for cancer. However, during the course of that trial, GSK sold their entire oncology portfolio to another pharmaceutical company, Novartis. So Votrient, that form of Pazopanib that they had, was sold to another company. And because that company had just acquired that oncology product, they were not interested in pursuing off-label clinical trials for that drug at the time. And so unfortunately, we had to stop that clinical trial, and the results from the trial were published. And the 7 patients who were able to participate in the trial at the time all experienced positive results, which was very exciting to hear. And so Cure HHT thought it would be worthwhile to keep going and invest in manufacturing their own form of Pazopanib. So you can take essentially the chemical compound or the component of the drug, Votrient, which is Pazopanib, and just repackage it in a different way. So we created a low dose 25 milligram form of Pazopanib, and then we had to do a lot of testing on it. So over the course of several years, through the manufacturing process, through applications for what we call a new drug application, and pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic testing, which is very important and essential to ensure the safety and the efficacy of the drug. So what the body is doing to the drug in terms of metabolism, and what the drug is doing to the body in terms of, is it actually doing what we want it to do to try to decrease bleeding. All of this testing took a lot of time and it took a lot of dollars. And this was done by Cure HHT from about 2017 until 2022. So over the course of 6 years and over $500,000, and with a lot of help, we were able to finally come to a place where we were in a lot of talks with the FDA, and we received a breakthrough therapy designation to put our form of Pazopanib into a clinical trial. But clinical trials are really expensive. And so we also needed the money to actually run the clinical trial. And that's where we were awarded a $5 million grant by the Department of Defense and almost another $1 million by the FDA in order to accomplish this goal. Those grants were applied for right at the beginning of COVID. And so all of those years of testing and waiting and applying for funding, finally we got the funding and COVID slowed everything down. Manufacturing of the drug, trying to get the vendors or all the people on board to help. But at long last, in 2023, we began recruitment for this clinical trial, and recruitment is well underway, and we are very excited and very happy to share more about what this clinical trial entails, how you can participate, and the updates that we've made to the eligibility criteria, and Dr. Gossage is going to be explaining those, and then both of us will be available to answer questions after. All right, go ahead, Dr. Gossage.
Close. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Good evening. Just want to thank everybody for joining. It's so close to time to dinner, and when we have some exciting news on the TV. So this may be more or less exciting depending on various things. Next. Okay, so Cassie has said a little bit about this. So what is Pazopanib? This is an oral medication that is currently FDA approved for the treatment of certain cancers. And FDA approved just means your doctor can write a prescription for it, and in general, insurance companies will usually cover it. Now, for the current HHT study that we're talking about today, it's important to realize that this is an experimental drug, which is given at 1/5 the cancer dose. And the hope is that since it's a lower dose than the cancer dose, that the side effects will be less. And for the most part, side effects are dose related, but that's not true for everything, but for most side effects. So in terms of what we call the mechanism of action, in other words, how Pazopanib works, that mechanism of action involves the inhibition of certain proteins and enzymes called tyrosine kinases, including what we call VEGFR2. And these are all believed to be involved in the development of AVMs and HHT. So these proteins and enzymes help AVMs to form in the body in HHT, and therefore we think if we inhibit them, make them less active, that might cause the AVMs to either not develop, or hopefully, even if they have already developed, to lessen, maybe even go away. Next slide. So just a few slides about how we've gotten here. And this is the study that Cassie mentioned, the one that was first set in motion by GSK, but then ultimately kind of got the nix when Novartis took over. But this is a prospective study of Pazopanib in 7 patients who had HHT-related bleeding. And the dose used in this study was 50 milligrams. As Cassie mentioned, all 7 patients showed an improvement in either the nosebleeds or their anemia. And this was published with Dr. Fawn as the first author in 2019, and it was entitled Pazopanib May Reduce Bleeding in Hereditary Hemorrhagic Telangiectasia. Next slide. That was our first hope that this drug may help HHT. Then Dr. Pramble, who runs the Cleveland Clinic HHT Center, published a report. This was a retrospective report. In other words, he's looking backwards on patients who have already received the drug, as opposed to the last study, which was a prospective study in which we enroll patients and then we look forward as they take the drug. Anyway, so he looked at 13 patients who had HHT-related bleeding, and all of whom needed blood transfusions. And in his study, all 13 showed an improvement in epistaxis, hemoglobin, and the need for RBC transfusions. This was published in 2022. Next slide. And then a report by Ahluwalia in 2022, and this was an oral presentation only. So it's not been formally published in a journal, at least as far as I'm aware. This is published at our last HHT conference. This is a retrospective study, again, looking back on patients who had received it already, of patients who had refractory HHT bleeding, so they had other types of treatment and just weren't responding. And 2/3 of their patients, 10 of them, had either a good or excellent response with improved nosebleeds, anemia, or transfusion need. This was published out of the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. So now moving on to the current study that we're here to talk about. Again, to emphasize, for the current study, Pazopanib is an experimental drug. It's FDA approved, but for other things. So physicians couldn't normally just write a prescription for this and expect to have an insurance company approve it. So just as an overall summary, the study starts with a 6 to 12 run-in period to assess your baseline severity. Then a 24-week randomized study of Pazopanib, 150 milligrams a day versus placebo. And then at the end of that 24-week period, there's an option to roll over to a 24-week study where all patients receive Pazopanib. That's called the open label part of the study. So maybe whoever's running the slides just kind of show as we go along, but things start out with the screen and enrolling visit at the beginning. And that's the point. That would be your first visit to the site. You would be evaluated for your eligibility. Then you would sign a consent form if everything looked okay. And then either then or up to 4 weeks later, you would start the run-in period. And this is a period where you're not taking any medicine. You're just going about normal life. You're filling in a nosebleed diary. And this is our time to assess, are you really stable? And do you really meet the criteria for the study? There are a few criteria that need to be assessed during the run-in period to know the answer to this. Then somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks later, usually 6 weeks, if everything looks good, you would be randomized. And basically, this is a process of essentially flipping a coin. And that determines whether you get the real drug, Pazopanib, or the placebo. Now, at the time of randomization, you won't know what you're getting. Your HHT specialist won't know what you're getting. Only the pharmacy that sends you the drug will know what you're getting. Now, this information will be available eventually, but not actually during the trial. Then you start drug, and that begins a 24-week period in which you're taking drug. Then at the end of 24 weeks, assuming everything goes good, you come back for your second visit to the site, and that'll finish this, what we call the Part B randomized study. And if things look good and you're interested, you have the option to roll over to the Part C study where everybody gets drug. Now it would be for another 24 weeks, and at the end of that, then it's a follow-up visit, a follow-up where we watch you off drug to see, well, how long does, if you did have a good response, how long does that response last? Next slide. So how do we define success for these studies? This is what we call the primary endpoint. And for the primary endpoint, we compare the number of patients who received Pazopanib and the number of patients who received placebo who had one of two things happen. Number one, they could show a 2-point increase in hemoglobin at weeks 19 through 24 compared to baseline, which is that run-in period, or they could show a 50% decrease in the duration of nosebleeds at weeks 19 to 24. In other words, the last 6 weeks of drug compared to the baseline. So looking at the lower left-hand graph, that's kind of an example of what a positive hemoglobin endpoint would look like. So at baseline, you started with a hemoglobin of about 10.5, and you can see it's just gradually going up over time. And at week 24, it's 12.5. That would be a 2-gram increase in hemoglobin, and that would be considered positive. Of course, if it was a 3 or 4 or 5-gram increase, that would also be positive. But if it didn't get any higher than, say, 11, which we see around week 12, then that would be negative. In other words, we would say that the drug did not work, at least for hemoglobin. Then on the other side of the slide, we have the bleeding duration. And that's the other half of our primary endpoint. And at baseline here, you see it starts out at 60 minutes a week, then gradually goes down to about 25 minutes a week at the end. And so that we're looking for at least a 50% decrease, and that would be met. So if a person had either one of these or both occur, we would consider that successful, at least for the purpose of the study. Next slide. So who can join this study? We call these the inclusion criteria. And one of the changes we made was we upped the maximum age to 85. So anywhere from 18 to 85. So if you're 17, no, you can't join. If you're 90, no, you can't join. You have to have a definite or probable diagnosis of HHT. So a pretty solid consideration that you have HHT. If it's just an iffy diagnosis, then you would not be eligible for the study. And that's, of course, that's a decision that your HHT doctor would make. Then the next thing, and this is one of the other ones we changed, was before you had to have at least 20 minutes of nosebleeds and a hemoglobin less than 11. So you had to be pretty severe on both of those counts. Now we're saying you have to be severe on one of those two counts. So at least 20 minutes of nosebleeds with a little bit of anemia, or at least 5 minutes of nosebleeds, a little bit of nosebleeding with a good bit of anemia, hemoglobin less than 10. So everybody's got to have at least a little anemia and a little bit of nosebleeds to get in. An important part of this is you have to have the ability to complete the daily blood pressure and nosebleed monitoring. This is something you do every single day. There's an app to enter your nosebleeds and an app that will send you home with a little blood pressure cuff, and that will hook up by Bluetooth with an app on your phone and will automatically register your blood pressure. So we can monitor what's going on with that. An important one is that you have to be willing to forego other treatments, such as laser or sclerotherapy. So if you join the study and let's say a month later, you don't really feel any better, and you say, I want to get a laser, that would be okay. You can get whatever treatment you want. But if you were to start any other treatments, that would take you out of the study. And the reason for that is basically if you get another treatment and you get better, we won't know if it's from the research study or from the new treatment that got you better. And the ultimate goal of this study is to be the truth teller as to whether the first 3 studies we've already talked about, are these really correct? Is this information proper and correct? And then finally, women of childbearing potential must use birth control because this medicine can severely affect the fetus during development. Now, there are other inclusion criteria, but they're more minor, but these are kind of the key ones I wanted to go through. Next slide. And then we have a list of exclusion criteria, in other words, people who can't join the study. So if you've got high blood pressure that we can't control despite medicines, then you would not be able to get in the study because that's one of the side effects of this medicine is high blood pressure. There are certain medications that you can't be taking, like simvastatin, which is a medicine to control cholesterol. Now we could take you off that medicine and put you on another one that could control cholesterol, and that would be okay. So just because you're on one of these medicines doesn't mean you can't join. You just have to switch over to something else before you start the study. Another important one is the systemic use of VEGF inhibitors. In other words, Avastin is one of the main ones, or other things like Pazopanib and Avastin, anytime in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So you could be on one of these, but you would have to come off of it and stabilize out before you could enroll in the study. And again, we need to know, this is to help us determine truthfully whether these medicines are actually working, this medicine is working. Incompletely treated lung or brain AVMs would exclude you. Malignancy in the last 5 years, except skin cancers are okay. Planned surgery during the study. So one of the side effects of Pazopanib and things like Avastin is it can decrease healing. And so if you have a surgery coming up, let's say a knee surgery or something more than just a minor surgery, then you would have to wait until after that surgery and you were healed before you could join this study. And in other things like heart disease or recent blood clots. And there's a moderately long list of these things, but these are some of the more major ones that would keep you out of the study. And certainly if you look at this list and you're saying, I'm not sure, or you're wondering, well, I take some medicines, you could talk to your doctor or one of the sites to learn more. Don't just assume that you can't get in. I just want to just go over some of these issues with you. Next slide. Okay, so what do you need to do during this study? We already mentioned there would be 2 in-person visits. So in other words, if you're coming to the Georgia Center and you live in Florida, you've got to drive up or fly up from Florida twice for this study. The first one is to enroll, and the second one is at week 24. And between those visits, you'll have virtual visits every 3 weeks, which means you'll get on the phone with our research coordinator, and they'll review how you're doing, any side effects, any new medicines, things like that. You'll take the study drug every day. You need to record your blood pressure and nosebleeds every day. This may not sound like much, but it's something. It's got to log onto the app, record your nosebleed every day, and if you have 3 nosebleeds, you need to record all 3 of them. Record your blood pressure once a day. And I mean, that maybe takes 5 minutes to do those things. Every 3 weeks, you need to fill out some questionnaires. They take a couple of minutes. They're not too bad. Just things about your quality of life and more in-depth questions about your nosebleeds. There are blood and urine tests that you would get done in the local lab every 3 weeks. Most people go to what we call a Quest lab. And for most sites, there are Quest labs close to them that they can just go to. Some people have them near where they work and can go in their lunch hour or something. But for places that don't have Quest labs, we're able to make arrangements with other lab services. So that can be a challenge to work out, but it hasn't kept us from enrolling any patients yet. And then at least at baseline and 6 weeks later, you need to take an electrocardiogram. And we're going to send you home with a little electrocardiogram machine. This is just a strap that goes around your chest. It connects with your smartphone and downloads an EKG. If there's any problems, you might need to take them up to every 6 weeks just to monitor things. Next slide. So we're talking about all the good things so far. What are the most common risks of Pazopanib? We've mentioned increased blood pressure. This is probably the most common, but it can almost always be treated with blood pressure medicines. So even if you develop some high blood pressure during the study, as long as we can get it under control with blood pressure medicines, you could stay in the study. Increased liver enzymes in the blood is somewhat common in people who are on the full dose for chemotherapy, for cancer drugs. We believe it's less common at this dose, but this is what the study is aimed to show, is whether that's true or not. There can be potential changes to the heart rhythm. That's why we're monitoring the EKG. Infections are possible, sometimes serious. Gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea can be seen. Low energy is common with drugs like cancer drugs. And protein in the urine is another side effect. These are pretty much the same side effects that can be seen with Avastin, except for the increase in liver enzymes. is usually not a problem there. Next slide. So what's it going to cost me to be in the study? Really not much for most people. The study drug and all the lab tests are free. You don't have to pay anything for those. Travel expenses are partially compensated, and I'll show a slide about that in a minute. The blood pressure and EKG device and the apps, that's all free, but the blood pressure cuff and EKG device must be returned at the end of the study. So for the majority of patients, there's no cost for the study. Now, the one thing where it might be a little bit of a cost would be if you've got to travel a significant distance, like a half hour to get to your every 3-week lab. That's not covered by the study. So in terms of travel reimbursement, this applies to your first visit when you enroll and your week 24 visit. And it's based on mileage. So for example, if you live 300 miles from the site that you're going to, you would go down to the second bullet, that would be $230. There's probably going to be an overnight stay for you, and you get $230 for that visit, for the first visit and for the second visit. Next slide. And this is just a list of the study sites where the clinical trial is occurring. And you can see that we've got majority of the United States covered, especially the East Coast, a little bit in the West Coast, some in the center. Texas is a little bit of an open area where we are desperately looking for a site. We're actually in negotiations with the Dallas site. They're interested in joining. We're trying to see if we can get them up and going before the end of the study. There's nothing really in kind of the middle west top of the country, but there's not many people up there anyway, so it's not as big a deal. No sites up there either. No HHT centers there either. Next slide. And this is just a list of the sites that are ongoing with some of the communication numbers and emails for the coordinators. And this is also present on the HHT website. If you go to the research tab and look up the study. And I think with that, I will turn things over for questioning.
Thank you, Doctors Gossage and Friday, for the wonderful presentations. We hope everyone enjoyed those presentations and hope that information answered your questions. But if not, now is the time to get those answered. So Dr. Gossage, Dr. Friday, we'll ask you to unmute yourself and turn those cameras on. It looks like we have a few questions here. The first one is from Anthony, who asks, is the Pazopanib clinical trial just for nosebleeds? What about lung AVMs or GI bleeding?
So I can take that one. So it's not for pulmonary AVMs. We so far have not found any drugs that can treat pulmonary AVMs, although it's possible that Pazopanib could. We're just not studying that aspect of HHT treatment. But as long as you have some nose bleeding, so 5 minutes a week, if you have GI bleeding as part of your illness, and it may be the majority of why you're anemic, that's fine. But you got to have a little bit of nose bleeding. So 5 minutes of nose bleeding and a lot of GI bleeding, you can still get into the study, which is one of the big changes that we made because we really recognize there are a number of people out there whose main problem with bleeding is GI bleeding.
Thanks, Dr. Gossage. We have another question here from Tony, who asks, what is the length of time you would need to have between having a nasal coblation and the study in order to qualify?
Right. So you have that run-in period at the beginning of the study. That's kind of like the baseline. So if you have that procedure already planned or scheduled, we still have time to evaluate and assess a good baseline of epistaxis and bleeding and hemoglobin levels for you to determine eligibility for the study. So there's really no set time. It's just you can't start and enroll in the study and start taking drug or placebo and then decide to have the procedure and maintain your eligibility for the study. you would have to disenroll from the study.
And I would like to add just a little bit to that, in that one of the other aspects of the run-in period is we're looking for stability. We want you to be stable at a stable baseline. So if you were to have, let's say, a sclerotherapy 1 week before you enrolled, and you went from terrible nosebleeds to no nosebleeds at all, we would probably want to wait a little bit longer, because it's unlikely that during that 6-week run-in period that you would go back to your normal baseline of bad nose bleeding, which is where we want you to just gradually be getting worse during run-in as the effects of the sclerotherapy would wear off. So it's a tough question, really, and that's one we would have to just take on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you both for that. The next question we have here is from Darren and Annika, who are asking about Northern California, specifically UCSD, and if there are any plans to expand recruiting sites other than what was presented in that map.
Not really. We're just running out of time is the problem. And we plan, our goal is for enrollment to finish by the end of December this year. So if you're interested in the study, don't dawdle. We've already enrolled 28 patients. We're looking for 70. So we're almost halfway done. And it takes 4, 5, sometimes 6 months to get a study up and going. I'm sorry, to get a site up and going. So the one we're working with right now is in UT Southwestern in Texas. We're hopeful we can get them up. We're already partway through, but a new site is just hard to make it happen. Would you agree with that, Cassie?
Yes, and it's also costly as well to bring new sites on board. And so we're trying to get the 12 sites that we have contracted up and enrolling, and everyone taking on patients. And we have a pretty decent geographical representation and throughout the country. And then the travel reimbursements do help. But if you're interested and you need help getting access to a site that's close to you, then just reach out to us, and we can help facilitate that.
Thank you both again. We have another one here from Lori, who's asking if you could elaborate on brain AVMs and what you mean by incompletely treated.
Yeah, so that's a pretty vague and short summary for what's going on with that. But basically, some of these things like Avastin and Pazopanib, there's a concern that it could cause bleeding in people who have things like a brain AVM. That's not completely clear, but that's a concern. And so really the exclusion criterion in the full protocol is a little bit more complicated than that. So it's people who have vascular malformations in the brain that have high risk features. In other words, high risk to bleed. So that could be size. It could be that they've got what they call an aneurysm associated with it. There are a number of different factors, and it's one of these things there's some subjectivity to it. But if you had an AVM that had not been treated in the brain, that would require a kind of a conversation with your neuro team as to what they think about this. And if they think it's high risk, then you would be excluded. If it was a tiny little AVM that was felt to be low risk, you could potentially get into the study.
Thanks for that, Dr. Gossage. We have one more here from Ed, who is asking, will atrial fib keep me out of this study?
Nope. Come on down.
Short and sweet. I like it. I actually have 2 questions for the panel here, so buckle up. I'm going to put you on the hot seat. The first one I wanted to ask is, so why is getting FDA approval for the first time ever for an HHT treatment a big deal?
Access for patients. So like Dr. Gossage had said earlier, FDA approval means that your doctor can easily write a prescription for you for this drug. you can't really write a prescription for Votrient for someone to treat their HHT related bleeding because it has a cancer indication. Insurance company is going to deny it and say they don't have cancer, they have HHT. So doing this clinical trial and going through FDA registration for this product, if it proves to be positive, will help us gain an indication for Pazopanib in the use of HHT related bleeding. So then insurance companies will be more amenable to approving the prescriptions for Pazopanib, and it doesn't have to be used off label, and we can have better and more broad access to this treatment for patients who could really benefit from it.
Thank you for that, Dr. Friday. Before we get to my last question, we do have one more here from Josh, who's saying that he's had laser done on his nose, and it sounds like his nosebleeds are pretty well managed or under control right now, but does have severe GI bleeding and is taking Avastin to help, but is still transfusion dependent. Would someone like him be eligible?
Well, not as long as you're taking Avastin. So if you would have to, you'd have to stop the Avastin. I recently had a somewhat similar patient who was on Avastin, but really had only gotten a little bit better on the Avastin for even after a year or so of Avastin. And she decided that she just, her quality of life was not good enough on the Avastin and she wanted to try something else. She came off the Avastin, got a little bit worse off the Avastin, and is now in the study. So that's a tough one, and you would have to have a good conversation with your HHT doctor, and potentially the site if your center is not an enrolling site, as to what that would mean for you, what the hope might be for you. But it's possible, but not while you're taking the Avastin. You'd have to come off and be up for at least a month and a half, if not several months.
And it's important to note that we don't have any studies directly comparing, Pazopanib and bevacizumab, which is Avastin. It's kind of we need many tools to treat many types of people sort of situation. Some people respond great to Avastin, and some people kind of lose their responsiveness over time. And some people it doesn't work well for. So that's why we need different options, and we're pursuing Pazopanib in this clinical trial to understand, if this may be an option for others that might be better, or when Avastin doesn't work for some.
And I would also add to that, in that middle paper, the one by Dr. Paramble and colleagues, he had several patients who had failed Avastin. Either they never got better on Avastin, or they got better and then, like Cassie said, lost their effectiveness, their response to it, and they were put on Pazopanib and did well on the Pazopanib. Now, whether it's overall better than Avastin, or maybe we'll see the same thing with Pazopanib, people who get better on Pazopanib, but then lose their benefit and then go to Avastin, and then they get better on Avastin. We don't know, but just because you didn't do as well as you wanted on Avastin doesn't mean this medication might not help you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for that. We have a couple more rolling in here, and we still have a few minutes. Lori and Julie are both asking fairly similar questions. Lori's asking, if you do receive drug on trial, does bleeding problems come back once you are off drug and medication? And Julie is asking that if the study proves positive, will patients have to be on this drug for the rest of their lives, or will that depend on other factors? So I guess it's how long we have to be on drug, and does bleeding problems return once you stop medication?
Yeah, we don't know for sure, and that's one of the things we're going to learn with that 12-week follow-up period after people stop the drug. But in general, my experience has been, when it helps people, when they stop it, just like with Avastin, the bleeding comes back, because these are drugs that are trying to keep those abnormal enzymes that are working against your blood vessels. And these drugs are keeping those at bay. That's how we see it happening. And we would expect that in at least most patients, that once you stop the medicine, things would come back again. Now, what the time frame is, at least for Avastin, sometimes people they get their 4 or 6 dose induction of Avastin, and then they may start having trouble again 2 or 3 months later. Whereas other people, a year later, they're still doing fine. So a lot of variability here, and that's what we hope to learn is a little bit more about the exact numbers in terms of when people start to get worse again, and is it everybody or most people or just some people?
Thanks for that. We have one more question in the chat here, which is asking if Pazopanib helps with liver AVMs at all.
Well, we don't know the answer to that. We suspect yes, based on the Avastin, since they're very similar, since Avastin helps liver AVMs, and we know that to be true. And although that's not the primary reason we're doing this study, we are looking at that in this study. So if you have liver AVMs in addition to your nose bleeding or GI bleeding, we'll monitor that. And in fact, we would do an echo at the beginning and end of the study just to see how your liver AVMs are doing. And that's one of the ways we measure how the liver AVMs are doing is with an echocardiogram. So we hope so, but we don't know yet.
Thanks for that. I think our last question tonight is going to be one that comes from me, Dr. Gossage. I'll pose this one for you. Curious what you might say if you heard from a patient that, you know what, I'll wait for somebody else to volunteer for a trial and participate in research. What would your response to that be?
Don't get me going. Well, if everybody said that, there would be no research. That's the bottom line. I don't know Kennedy or Churchill who said it, but if not now, when? If not you, who? Something like that. Or maybe I just made that up. I can't remember. But definitely, if not you, who? So get involved, and especially this is a disease that affects your family, probably, if you're listening to this. And even if it doesn't help you, it might help your kid or your grandkid or your niece and nephew. So there's so much help that can be had from each person who gets involved in this.
Thank you, Dr. Gossage, and thank you, Dr. Friday, for the time and presentation here today. That's going to conclude our program for tonight. We hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. If you want to go back and rewatch to make sure you understood everything correctly, this will be recorded and posted to our website shortly. Please do stay connected with us. If you are not following us on social media or subscribe to our emails, I would please encourage you to do so. There is simply no better way to stay up to date on the latest in HHT news, research, and care than by doing so. Please do also look out for that post-webinar survey. We really do value your feedback to continue to build programming that's meaningful to you, the patients, because at the end of the day, that's what we're here for at CureHHT, is to support you. So with that, I want to thank our speakers again for their time and expertise tonight, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks, everybody.